Every product, policy, and practice actually has two prices: the one on the receipt that's paid now, so to speak, and the long term impact, the one someone pays later. And that second price isn't always money. Sometimes it's your health. It's poor air quality that you're breathing during wildfire season, or you can't swim in the lake because there's too much cyanobacteria. So you're already paying for decisions that you didn't make. And if we don't start naming that second price and doing something about it, we're the generation that hands this to our children and our grandchildren. This episode is about learning to see that price, taking action so that it's not somebody else's inheritance. Last week here in Vermont, like 15 other states, we had wildfire smoke that was causing really unsafe breathing conditions. And the smoke was coming from Canada. Our Department of Environmental Conservation was saying that this smoke was even worse than the big one in 2023. What if I told you that that smoke traces back to a decision that goes back decades to spray a toxic chemical on the forests that actually stripped away the one thing that would have kept the fires down? Before I get into this episode, if you haven't yet, grab my 10 words on food labels that are lying to you. You can find it in the show notes or go to greenlivingnow.com. Okay, let's get into it. Back in 1996, I was living in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and I saw in the newspaper that our town, our little tiny seacoast town, had 3 types of cancer above the state average. And I was shocked. And it really caused quite a stir in the community. Prior to this, I had been writing letters to the editor of the local newspaper talking about what I had discovered from that little non-toxic baby book, which showed me that there were toxic chemicals legally allowed in everyday household products, including baby products, baby shampoos, baby creams, diapers, you name it, as well as many other household products. I had already organized a town-wide event called the Marblehead Earth Fest, where I introduced green living workshops and vendors and organic food, and people were really starting to wake up. Not that I didn't have to battle with the Better Living Through Chemicals people, but there was a new awareness. And so when this statistic came out, people were pretty up in arms. And I decided that I was going to start a new nonprofit called the Marblehead Cancer Prevention Project. And we tried to figure out what could possibly be the environmental contributions to those types of cancer. The only thing we could see was that there was a coal-fired power plant in the town next door. But the bigger one was the use of pesticides on trees and lawns. This is a wealthy community. People really valued the weed-free lawn back then. There were also higher than average dog and cat cancers. I thought to myself, I really need to talk to the Board of Health and see if I can get them on board to tighten up these pesticide spraying rules. Because one of the things that was so frustrating is that if you wanted to have an organic garden in your yard, but your neighbors hired a tree service or a lawn service, that stuff would drift onto your food or your children and the dogs playing on the lawn. So I marched into the Department of Health and I told them what I had learned and asked them if there was anything they would be willing to do. And turns out we worked on a proposal to tighten up the pesticide spraying regulations in the town, which was a great success. But decades later, the same pattern exists where someone else is paying the price for a decision that they didn't make. And it's playing out all over the place, including on our organic farm here in Vermont. So as I said, every choice has a visible price and a hidden price, and you're the one who pays it. And it's not always money. Oftentimes it's health or a poisoned watershed or declines in pollinators. And then we hand these problems down to our kids if we don't fix it. But this really isn't a story about villains. It's about how we tend to make choices based on incentives. So for example, a CEO of a company wants to make good quality products, but they end up choosing cheaper materials because of the pressure from shareholders to generate profits. Or maybe there's a politician who believes in preventative health care, but it's not going to get him or her elected in the next election. So they end up funding bills that really go against their core beliefs. Or maybe there's a farmer who really would love to go organic regenerative, but their loan payments are due, their existing machinery doesn't work, or their land needs to sit for 3 years before it's even able to be considered organic and regenerative. So there's a lot of different choices that we all make every day. Sometimes we choose convenience food over what's really healthy. How many people do you know DoorDash or use some of the other delivery services instead of cooking from scratch, or buy the cheap junk food, the fast food, because they don't have time to cook? Unfortunately, the hidden price that creates is a toxic food system, first of all, but then the healthcare system, the increase in obesity, diabetes, heart problems, and all kinds of autoimmune diseases. And then there's soil degradation, air and water pollution, and the mounting plastic waste. There's the higher healthcare costs down the line. It's one of the reasons why I feel like eating healthy, certified organic, whole foods is an investment in my health. And it's not just that, it's also getting rid of toxins in your home and also choosing holistic health strategies to actually prevent illness and sometimes turn it around without having to resort to pharmaceuticals. That's an investment in my health that has made sense to me over the years. But a lot of times we're faced with, maybe we have a tight budget and we would love to buy that solid wood piece of furniture, but unfortunately it's out of our price range. So we end up getting the cheap manufactured wood one, which isn't very durable and probably breaks down much sooner. It looks like a low cost today, but the hidden price is that it's funding more landfill waste, more resource extraction, and it's often higher lifetime spending when you factor in the replacement. So that's cheap furniture, fast fashion, those really cheap t-shirts and things that are designed to last a really short amount of time, disposable kitchenware, low quality appliances. I can't believe how quickly refrigerators, washing machines, and dryers seem to fail. Like, whatever happened to the Maytag man? Then there's the whole home building process of choosing cheap materials to slap a house together so that some family can afford to buy it. Maybe the construction's faster and the prices are cheaper, but does it really last? And how many problems is that family going to be dealing with down the road? Maybe there's higher energy bills because it's not well insulated, or there's mold problems that create other health issues, as well as decaying wood in the walls, poor indoor air quality, or maybe pests like mice get into the house and cause problems. It ends up creating expensive repairs down the road. And then we see it in agriculture with these monoculture farms that are growing one crop, and they have to spray it heavily with chemicals to keep the pests off of it or the fungus off of it. They use mechanical farming techniques, so they don't really need a lot of human labor. And it gives them a predictable commodity, which is heavily subsidized in this country, which I've talked about in a blog post. But then there's the hidden price of the soil degradation. Our topsoils are disappearing. We're losing nutrients in our soils. We don't have a lot of biodiversity because of that type of farming prioritization. There's a growing dependence on fertilizers and chemical interventions to deal with the increasing numbers of pests, but it also opens us up to greater drought and pest vulnerability. And then our pollinators are declining terribly. And it's worth noting that some of the certified organic farming practices that we and others use, like crop rotation and creating a diversity of different crops, not just the same thing in one farm. It's more like the way nature grows, really. It's a way to build long-term resilience, but it requires a different investment and a different type of management. So the common thread here is that we often optimize for convenience over resilience, speed over durability, low upfront cost versus lifetime cost, immediate comfort over long-term health, individual gain often over collective well-being. So we're not really thinking about the impact to others, symptoms being treated versus figuring out the root causes, which we talk a lot about in this podcast. And behavioral economists call this present bias. We're wired to value immediate rewards over future benefits. And it's reinforced by our systems that demand quarterly returns or getting elected again, and marketing that all reward short-term wins. So a couple of months ago, I was down in the farm stand and I noticed across the road the big pesticide tanker trucks were rolling in. Even though it wasn't that windy of a day, I thought, oh God, they're spraying glyphosate on the GMO corn that they're growing for the dairy cows. This is a leased piece of land that this big conventional dairy is using among other locations all over the Mad River Valley. And I said to myself, I've got to get out of here. I'm going up to the house. I don't want to breathe any of this stuff because I know it's linked to cancer. It pissed me off because this used to be a field that was growing alfalfa for hay, which was wonderful. But a couple of years ago, they switched it to growing this genetically modified feed corn. And they sprayed it twice last year with glyphosate. And I know that glyphosate is an issue, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I know that this dairy farm and others, which is a conventional dairy farm, believes that they're doing the right thing. They're using this no-till method, which means they don't use heavy machinery in the cornfields, but instead they plant the corn right into the weeds, and then they kill off the weeds. And because it's a genetically modified corn, it's created to withstand this type of glyphosate product. And that is the main ingredient in Roundup, which used to be the same thing that you could buy at the hardware store for homeowner use. But now I guess glyphosate is mostly in the commercial growing industry's product. But one of the issues is that you're not supposed to spray it when there's any wind because then it'll drift. But the biggest problem for us is that my husband Dave grows certified organic corn. And if that GMO corn is ripening at the same time as his corn, the pollens could actually drift and connect, and that would be a huge issue for us. Thankfully, the timing is off so that they don't come to fruition at the same time. The other issue is that glyphosate has phosphorus as a breakdown product, and the soils here in Vermont are already high in phosphorus, and it binds with the soil. And when there's a heavy rain or a flood, which happens more these days than ever, it washes it right into the river, which is back behind that field and many other fields that are growing this GMO corn. And so once that phosphorus is in the river, it then travels to Lake Champlain, and it creates a big issue with the cyanobacteria growth. So the visible price is that it's cheaper for the glyphosate and spraying it to get rid of all those weeds, but the long-term effects are the real cost, the hidden price. And actually, the hidden price could also be our organic certification, the watershed that impacts everybody. We've been seeing for years now that different parts of Lake Champlain have been shut down to swimming because of this blue-green algae cyanobacteria that is forming as a result of this excess phosphorus. And the amount of phosphorus has been rising in Lake Champlain over the years. The other issue is that synthetic nitrogen phosphorus fertilizer runoff has the same kind of impact. And it's responsible for nearly half of the impaired lakes in the United States. Then you add homeowner lawn chemicals runoff into the same watersheds via the storms, and then failing septic systems are another issue that contribute nutrients and pathogens into the waterways. So it's not like there's one villain. It's the stacking of many small, maybe individually justified decisions that adds up to a lake that nobody can swim in. And it's actually the same dynamic that happens in our home. It's not just one product that's causing indoor air pollution and issues with health potentially, but it's the air fresheners that are covering up whatever is causing the odors in the house. Or it's the cleaning product chemicals that are like when you walk down an aisle of a supermarket and you see all the cleaning products, you can smell a lot of those, even in those tightly closed bottles. Well, imagine when you're using them and you're in a home that's closed up tight in the winter because you're trying to be energy efficient, it's adding all this toxic load. And then you add in whatever you're using for laundry detergent and your shampoos, creams, and makeups, all of these different products that we use, building materials, carpets, paints, stains, they all contribute some form of off-gassing of these chemicals that create like a chemical soup in our homes. But I want to get back to the air pollution from the forest fires in Canada, because I think it's a really important topic to understand. For years, a bunch of these Canadian forests were aerial spraying glyphosate onto the trees. And the whole goal was to kill off the less valuable to the commercial loggers wood. That would be things like the aspen and the birch, which tend to be wetter trees, in favor of the conifers, the pines. But the problem is that those less desirable woods were actually the ones that helped keep forest fires down because they tend to be wetter and they're considered the asbestos forests, not to mention the biodiversity aspect. If you have one type or two types of trees in a forest, inevitably that's going to end up causing problems, even as far as pests. And British Columbia's own Forest Practices Board in June of 2023 did a special report, and they said that the way forests and fire have been managed in British Columbia over the last 100 years has increased the scale and intensity of current wildfires and decreased landscape resilience. I'm not saying that glyphosate was the cause of the fires, but I'm saying that it's a contributing factor. Because actually, they use glyphosate when they're growing conventional oats or wheat, first on the product as it's growing, but then once it's grown, they spray it again to desiccate it, which basically dries it out to make it easier to get the grains. So doesn't it stand to logic that if you're using glyphosate to dry a plant, what's it doing to those trees? But it seems like it's a decision that's made to make more money without thinking about the long-term or even short-term impact of these fires billowing smoke so that it's unhealthy for people to breathe all over the country. There were like 16 states affected by this. Here's another example: antibiotic overuse in livestock, making them much less effective for people when they need them. In a Food and Drug Administration 2024 summary report, they said that the sales and distribution of medically important antimicrobial drugs for food producing animals rose 16% from 2023 to 2024. And that actually reversed a period of where it was relatively stable since 2017. Then as of 2020, nearly twice as many medically important antibiotics were sold for livestock as for human medicine. So we're feeding these antibiotics to animals in huge numbers. And a lot of that has to do with the horrible living conditions that these poor creatures are raised in. The big issue is that it creates, as I said in the beginning of this section, it creates an antibiotic resistance that then crosses into human health. So if you're having an infection that only an antibiotic can get rid of, good luck. Just like the air freshener that's masking your ability to smell the odor, instead of you actually looking to see what's the cause of the smell and get rid of that, a lot of modern medicine works the same way. As I talk about in this podcast with a lot of my guests, we are treating symptoms oftentimes with pharmaceuticals, which then have their own impact, instead of looking at what's causing the problem and getting rid of that or fixing that in some way. Some of my guests have talked about how they've had to heal themselves after they've had some kind of life-threatening illness. Maybe you've heard some of those interviews, and Western medicine was not able to help them. They figured out how to change their food and their household products, got rid of the toxins in those, and using holistic health strategies that really help them heal. So it's back to that whole visible price. The visible price is the fast acting insurance covered pharmaceutical versus the hidden price, which is that the root cause never gets found and fixed. And then it can get worse year after year until it's really a crisis. The overarching theme that we keep seeing over and over again is that a product can cause harm, and instead of fixing it and making it safer, it's about protecting the company and not the people that get hurt. Just like the vaccine liability shielding that happened in 1986, when they created the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, it basically shielded the manufacturers from any lawsuits from harm caused by any vaccine. And instead, they created this fund to help pay for people who had issues. In Vermont, we had a situation recently where an act was passed 2 years ago. It's called Act 181. And it really impacted us rural landowners quite profoundly, but nobody knew about it. The only people that went to testify when the bill was brought up in the committee were the lobbyists and the non-governmental organizations. And so come to find out, when this bill was going to start triggering issues that were going to cost people money if they wanted to build a house for their children on their farm or build something on their land, there were these different triggers that were going to create a whole bunch of red tape and paperwork and money spent that most people don't have. A lot of people in Vermont, their wealth tends to be tied up in their land. A lot of us rural folks, one of the issues is that we felt like none of us were made aware of this, much less invited to speak about how this might impact us, but made people feel like their voices weren't heard. But the good news was that a Facebook group was started where we all started sharing information and we were emailing our legislators and people were sharing the emails that they were writing to give other people ideas. And now we're a group of over 16,000 people. And we were able, through pressure and showing up at meetings and speaking out, we got the two main egregious aspects of that bill taken away. So that tells you that people do have power, especially when they become informed and they work together. Oh, it's called Rural Vermont Rising. So it's very similar to my earlier Marblehead experience, much smaller group that I had working with me, but the same idea is something comes out that we realize is detrimental. In that case, it was the 3 types of cancer, and working together with the local board of health to get restrictions put in place for pesticide spraying. So that's another example of how becoming aware and working together really pays off. It really emphasizes that the more we learn and work together as a community, the more we can impact positive change. And it's really not necessarily about who to blame. I mean, sometimes they're villains in the story, yes, but overall, I think many humans are trying to do the right thing, but they're valuing that first price, the immediate cost versus the longer term impact. So we have to think about who's paying that. Is it our health, the health of our environment? And then we're passing that on to our children and grandchildren. The more I think about all that I've learned over these many years of less toxic, eco-friendly, and holistic living, the more I realize we are living off of ecological credit cards. Here's what I mean. We are depleting the soils faster than they can regenerate. Our soils are no longer as nutrient dense as they were when my grandmother was growing vegetables in her garden. We burn fossil fuels that have accumulated over millions of years in this earth. We're spending healthcare dollars treating preventable diseases. We build disposable products that becomes tomorrow's landfill or dead zones in the ocean filled with plastic. We're running governments with deferred infrastructure maintenance. We are using up too much water, and we're clear-cutting forests without giving them time to regenerate or spraying them with glyphosate. But for decades, we've been told we're building wealth. But in many cases, we're simply becoming experts at building debt or at borrowing from our health, from our soils, from the air, from the water, from our forests, from our children, from the future. The problem is when we borrow from the future never gets a vote, and every decision either compounds resilience or compounds debt. The question isn't, are we leaving something behind? We are. The question is, are we leaving assets or liabilities? Some suggestions I have for you is try not to buy the cheapest thing. If money is really tight and that's all you can do, then that's the best you can do. But try to think about the long-term value of something. So solid wood floors versus vinyl, for example. Will this still be serving me in 20 years? You want to favor durable and well-made and repairable. And it's important to ask, what's the hidden cost? For example, conventional food versus certified organic. The hidden costs are all the toxic practices of conventional growing, not to mention the monocropping and the impact not only on human health, but on animals and pollinators, the soil, the air, and the water. Our choices really do make a difference. What we pay for is basically telling the manufacturer of that product, we want more of that. One of the most important things that I've been continually talking about in these podcasts is the value of prevention, trying to not get sick, nutrient-dense food, whole foods, organic foods, sleep, good movement, stress reduction, reducing your exposure to harmful toxins in all kinds of products and practices. It's not a guarantee against illness, but it certainly moves the odds in your favor. And making choices like grow a pollinator garden in your yard or choose native species to plant. Work on building a healthier soil, building it with organic matter. Definitely support your local certified organic farmers. Grow as much of your own food as you can. Contact your legislators. If you see something coming down the pike, it's actually really important to go to your legislature's website, find out what the bills are that they're dealing with. And if you have a particular perspective on one of them, contact that committee and ask to do a testimony so that it's not all just the lobbyists and non-governmental organizations, that your voice is heard. It's important to teach this to the next generation, to ask these questions: who benefits, who pays later, and what can I do about it? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. Please leave some comments below. I think this is an important topic. I look forward to seeing you in the next podcast.